Plugin of the week comes from Tone Projects. It's the Unisum plugin. This is a features-only video, so we're just going to go over the graphic user interface and explain all of the features of the plugin. This thing is a monster. This is an incredible plugin that is just got so much going on that it requires a separate video just to kind of dig into all of the settings and really understand what's there. And so let's just get right to it. So it all starts here. Let's just start just quickly with the menu bar up at the top here. We have a little A/B for doing comparison, one that copies, settings from one side to the other. There's a preset menu here, so you have some presets from different people. This is put together and really developed all by mastering engineers, people who do really high-end work. So the detail on this is really spectacular. And I'm not sure how well it can be appreciated outside of the mastering realm in terms of the subtlety of some of the settings, but I will certainly show off as best I can what's here, and then tell you to kind of focus on the aspect of the sound that I'm hearing, and maybe that translates. So we have here load and save, right, for your own parameters. You can link or unlink the parameters here for the left and right channel. You can operate in mid-side mode or in left-right, and there are 3 quality settings. So the pristine is the most high quality of all of them. It loads up by default as high quality, and so pristine will give you the clearest of sounds, least amount of artifact, distortion, aliasing, as much as there is, which is not a lot. You have a on-off button, which is over here. And then we'll kind of focus here just on this side just for a second, just so I can kind of give you an idea, because the settings are basically duplicated on the left and right, so everything will be the same. We have a threshold, ratio, attack, and release. So those are all the basic settings that you would normally expect. And then there's also a sidechain high-pass filter. So this is a 6 dB per octave filter on the low end. Again, mostly a typical thing that you would expect from a mastering plugin or any kind of compressor plugin. There's a sidechain emphasis. So what this is like a bell curve EQ boost within a particular frequency, selectable frequency zone. So you can kind of step your way through those. And this allows you to focus the compression to be keyed or triggered a bit more by a particular frequency area. So you kind of have these toggle points that you can kind of go through, which are more or less octave, going up and down, a little bit off from that, but pretty close. Now, when we get to some of these other features, we're going to get into more shaping kind of a feature. What we have is a feature which is called relax. Now, the relax actually is something that sets the transfer curve. How they describe it, it sets the transfer curve to the maximum amount of compression, which basically says it's shaping the attack, or the way the attack of the compression is applied. So if you're in linear, and this is not a knee control, so I'll explain that in a little bit differently, but it does shape the way it goes. So if you find that you need to have a sort of fast attack setting, but it's kind of suffocating your transients a little bit, you can sort of relax it on that back end, and then it will help to kind of open up the sound a bit more. The gain reduction limit is really cool. That's great. So this is basically setting like a range feature for how much gain reduction. So you could basically say there's never more than 4 dB of gain reduction at any given point, and that would keep you from getting like an exaggerated amount of gain. That's really helpful for so many situations where perhaps you have some big event in the mix, like an explosion or some like big low end kick or something that has a lot of energy that may cause an excessive amount of compression. And most of the time, the way that you have to dodge around that is by maybe trying to automate thresholds or things like that. Here, you could just set a limit for the amount of gain reduction, so you can allow it to sort of push into something but never compress more than a given amount. You have a knee control, right, for adjusting the knee. So 0 would be effectively a hard knee setting, and then you go soft as you go down. The release curve is kind of an interesting thing. So this is a way, and I've always loved this kind of thing, and you get it with different analog components. Different analog compressors will have different release curve characteristics. The release curve basically sets it from linear to logarithmic, meaning that what you do is you get kind of a shape to the way the way that the recovery goes. So rather than being this sort of linear path, which is kind of what you get with most digital compressors, having the logarithmic setting allows you to kind of shape it so it can change the release characteristic to something that may be a little bit more warming, right? And it'll just subtly change the characteristic of the release. So you have to kind of hear that. The HYGGE is essentially a harmonic distortion engine. It's not an emulation of anything in particular, but something that an algorithm that was put together by the creators of Unisum, the people who coded this, and it adds a great warming, kind of thickening characteristic. So I'll add that in just so you can kind of hear that. But it's actually, it sounds really amazing. So it's a great thing to sort of add in. A lot of times going to a particular compressor is about coloration. I think what you're really looking for generally with this is ultra detailed control over whatever it is that you're working on. We have a makeup gain control here. So this is at the very end stage. We have a wet dry, so you can run parallel. Now, what's cool about this is that you can solo up the sections here, which is kind of cool. So you could solo up left or solo up the right channel. Okay, so it gives you that capability. And if you're working in mid-side mode, this would be mid-inside. And so you could solo up, and that would allow you to sort of tweak in particular characteristics that you might not be able to key in on a little bit more carefully. Now, in the center here, what we have is a link between the gain reduction of the two sides. We have the gain reduction meter in the middle, and what it'll show is your true gain reduction, ppm, or VU. So these are just the ballistics of how you're used to seeing gain reduction. So true gain reduction is very seldom reflected in what you would see in a VU meter or a ppm meter. And the ballistic or the characteristics of those types of meters, the ppm and the VU, is that generally with the ppm, for example, you get a very fast initial response to the amount of gain reduction, but a slightly slower recovery. So it won't be quite as fast, and the VU will be even slower than that. With the true gain reduction, will show you a lot more movement. And so when you watch the meter here, you may see some radical movement. You think, wow, is it really moving that much? And that's really what's going on. And I sometimes comment on this in videos where I talk about the gain reduction is moving faster than what the meter is displaying. And you see that a lot where the VU is being displayed. But you could switch to those characteristics if that's more like along the lines of what you want to hear. Now, when you click on the settings here, you can open it up. So now we can make the range here a total of 2.5. So you can really key in on the exact amount of gain reduction here if you're doing it minimally. And this shows you up to 20 dB of gain reduction. So you can really work with this and zoom in sort of as much as you need to. The channel link is all about how the gain reduction is applied left-right. So if we pull this all the way over to the left, what we have is 100% lock. So if we get something that triggers gain reduction more on the left than on the right, it will kind of apply equal gain reduction to both sides. If we make them independent, then the gain reduction on the left will be completely independent and triggered by whatever information is on that side. And so sometimes this is a control. Having the variability with it is really amazing, because what you could do sometimes with this is you can kind of open up the sound field a little bit if the gain reduction is slightly different on either side, which can create a little bit more movement and separation between the two sides. This tied together usually will make everything a bit more solid in the middle. So finding some kind of medium or having the ability to do this is really powerful feature. So that's really cool. It also works really well in conjunction with this other feature, which I'm going to skip to down here, the channeling features. When you go off from this, there's an RMS or peak bias. And what this control does is it allows you to lean the responsiveness of the threshold and the transfer curve settings over here, which is like threshold, ratio, attack, release. And lean it more to be more responsive to peak energy. So you can make it, if you do it this way, what happens is now you'll get this very responsive, very kind of active pumping and breathing, which is great for kind of pulling a little bit of life out of something that maybe doesn't have it as much. And then if you lean the other way, excuse me here, let's flip in the display. If I pull it here towards RMS energy, then I can smooth out the reverb. And so smooth out the sound of the compression. And so this control is really powerful. And so even if you kind of pull that off a little bit, because once this is in the fully locked mode, this is not available to you. But very cool, very cool. So the power of this, all of these settings, just in the accuracy, just on its own, is really amazing. What makes this even more powerful is the whole multi-band detector section. So normally what you get with a lot of mastering grade plugins and most other plugins that you see, even a vintage emulations, they'll throw something in for sidechain, and it's usually a high pass filter, and maybe you get some kind of bell curve for emphasis, so you could pick a frequency, boost it, and get the compression to key in. What this does is like so much more sophisticated. So imagine the input signal coming in. So the process signal will go through here, but the sidechain signal that is an internal sidechain will be a split of that same signal, and it now gets divided into 3 bands, high, mid, and low. You could set your frequencies here between those different bands. So now you have different settings for high, mid, and low. So the detection of the RMS speed, this is sort of unusual. So the RMS speed is the detection characteristics of the RMS energy. So there's peak energy and there's RMS energy within any one of these bands. It's more dominant in the mid band to have peak energy. You'll get less RMS energy in the high band, although if you have like ride cymbals or something that's really like a China cymbal that's really crashing through a particular section, you can get more RMS energy up on the top end as well. And the low end is more dominantly RMS energy naturally. Okay, so what we have here are some elements that allow you to shape the speed of the detection of that. Now, this is sort of it will make kind of more sense as you kind of go through audio examples and kind of work with it a bit. But that's the basic starting point. And then there's a peak gain. So this sets the gain of the peak detector. So what you're doing with these two settings and what you see with these two LEDs is you'll see RMS LED light up here, peak energy LED light up here. And what you want to get is you have the ability to control within each of these bands what part of that signal is triggering the gain reduction with the given settings, attack, release, etc. And you have the ability to weight the responsiveness more towards the RMS or more towards the peak energy as you're going through. And on top of that, you can affect the ratio within the different bands. So in other words, if, for example, like high frequency energy pushes a lot, you can actually increase the ratio by up to 10 times. And so what you'll see there, so all of a sudden this would become 20 to 1 if high frequency energy is pushing the threshold. So you can actually have kind of an active variable threshold ratio setting that's affected here by the energy that's pushed within any of these bands. So you can see how this can start to get really, really heavy in terms of the detailed amount of control. So what this means, which is really cool, is sometimes if you have excessive things like low sub kick kind of thing, let's just say that it's it's like an 808 and it's super loud in the mix. You can actually, and if it's over triggering the gain reduction, you can filter it out to some degree, but you can also just have it still trigger it, but also weaken its effect within the mix so that the ratio actually shifts lower when you're working, when that kind of cuts through in the compressor. So this just gives you a tremendous amount of control about the way that the compression characteristics are applied. And I think one of the most challenging things that always occurs, especially with analog emulations and the such, is the ability to sort of get, if you're looking to achieve a certain type of movement with the compression or a certain characteristic or a certain smoothness, sometimes a singular element within the mix can sort of muck up all the works. And sometimes with sidechains, you can sort of filter those aspects out. But sometimes you can't. And having this detailed control is incredibly powerful, right? In terms of being able to shape the responsiveness of the compression based on the uniqueness of each individual song. And I've never seen anything with this much control. This ability to control things on the sidechain or anywhere. So it's really powerful in that way. Now, just to be clear, this is not a multi-band compressor. It's a full band compression. So this is just controlling the sidechain characteristics. Okay, normally in vintage components there'll be a sidechain EQ, and that's about what you get. Here, this just gives you a tremendous amount of detail control. Now you can affect the attack and release characteristics. So where the multiband detector modulates the ratio based on the RMS or peak energy and the way that you weight it, the attack and release modifiers here will allow you to modulate the attack and release settings based on loud sections and quiet sections. So essentially what you have here, and you can turn these on or off, is you have a crossover, which determines what is considered loud versus what is considered quiet. You have the same metering here with the two LEDs, just like what you have over here, where this would show RMS and peak. This would show loud section versus a quiet section. And then here you have modifiers. So in this case, for example, you would make the attack time 1/10 of what it was. So if it's set to 1 millisecond, it would make it 0.1 milliseconds. And you can increase that up to 10 times. So it allows you plus minus, or 1/10 versus 10 times on the attack time between loud and quiet sections. So this allows you to modify the settings relative to the ones that you've made up here during quiet and louder sections, which gives you much more control. So you can make the attack time faster during louder sections and make the release time faster during louder sections, and then slow it down for softer sections. Now, the crossover level, as I said, is the crossover point, which determines the two, and follow the LEDs to see when it's transferring from one to the other. Now, the memory effect is an interesting characteristic. What it is, it sort of emulates, if you move it to the right, it emulates the characteristics of an optical component, where what will happen is that if you have excessive gain reduction or heavy gain reduction, say in an optical compressor like an LA2A, there'll be a certain memory to the optical component where it will hold on to some of the light energy, therefore softening or slowing down the attack and release characteristics. And that is essentially what this knob does here. So you'll crank it up, and percentage wise, it will give you that effect. And you can also go to a negative percentage to perform the opposite effect. So it gives you that control as well. The transient override overrides the attack and release on transients. Now, when it's in its default offsetting, it does nothing. And again, there's indicators here for all of these functions when they're actually in action, so you can see what's going on as it's happening. The transient override allows you to either operate fast or slow. In other words, you can modulate the attack time and release time to be faster or slower based on the transients. So this is connected to the peak gain controls that you have over here, because this allows you to determine what exactly is triggering over here. And then this transient override would allow you to, say, set faster attack and release settings just for transients. And so you can modulate that here, and each one of these operates as a threshold. So you could see here a threshold number here, and again you would see the indication here. So you can see how this has a lot of control in terms of modulating overall quiet and loud sections as well as transients, all independent of each other, which is pretty amazing. Now, if that isn't enough for you, there's a whole secondary level of compression that operates in parallel with all of the settings that you have here. So what this does is it's an additive. So what you have is the ability to take this second layer of compression and add to that time. So if we have the attack set to 250 milliseconds, it will add 250 milliseconds onto the attack time, and this layer will run underneath. So this way, what you can have here is sort of very much like an averaging kind of compression, where you essentially have very slow attack, very slow release, that's 4.5 seconds on the release, and then you can blend that in by percentage. So this will go from 0 up to 100%, and it'll give you the ability to blend that in as a way of sort of averaging out, or kind of maybe preventing any pumping and breathing that might be happening. Or if it sounds like it's a little bit excessive, you can mix a little bit of that in to sort of smooth everything out. Now, the envelope smoothing is essentially a way of controlling the transition or the speed of the transition between the main layer of compression and the secondary layer of compression. So there's a lot of control here. It's a lot to digest here in terms of the control. And if that's not all enough for you, there's also the channel link controls. Now, before I talked a little bit about the setup here of linking or unlinking the sides and having the percentage control. So if you're anything other than fully linked, what will happen here is the RMS peak bias will determine whether low frequency, or I'm sorry, not low frequency, RMS energy or peak energy is what is primarily linking the two channels to each other. So that's what that main control is for. So you could have the RMS energy sort of anchoring everything and keeping the gain reduction consistent, if maybe that's what's driving the majority of gain reduction. Or if it's peak energy, you can lift it towards peak energy and keep the consistency there with the peak energy. Now, there are two other controls here that also affect this. One is a filter. And so what the filter here does is it will lean towards low frequency or high frequency energy. So what this will do is it'll put less influence on low frequencies if you pull it to the left for linking, or less influence of higher frequencies on the linking. So this is different from peak versus RMS. This is frequency based. So this allows you to determine how the channel linking is modified. Now, there also may be sometimes, occasionally, more radical differences between the gain reduction on one side versus the other. Maybe you have some loud drum hit that occurs on the left but doesn't occur on the right, maybe just coming out of a break section or something. So what you can do in these cases is you can actually limit the differential between the left and the right side. So in other words, you could set sort of a maximum difference that will occur. So if you set this, say, to 2 dB, then there will never be more than a 2 dB difference between the gain reduction on one side versus the other. And again, when this is happening, you'll see an LED that lights up down here. So there's loads of stuff. And then as a way of kind of helping you kind of through this, because it's somewhat complicated, and if you're kind of going through all of these settings, and it's worth obviously reading the manual, but obviously the purpose of the video here is to kind of give you a guide for what all of this means. There's also a style section, and what the style section does here is it actually helps give presets just for this section, so it will not affect any of the settings up above. And what you could do, for example, is load up an opto setting. And what it will do is it will set up this whole section to operate. You can see the memory effect up higher over here. The settings or influence the settings here that you have to operate more like an opto compressor, or more like a Rms compressor, or more like a FET compressor. And so you can look at this, and if you follow the settings and look carefully and just run some presets through there, notice what's going on, this will help to inform you about how these sections functionally work and how they're different. So there's a number of them. There's a default that comes up when you load up the plugin. There's a smoothing one. It's more RMS influenced, an energetic and aggressive one. It's probably more peak influenced. And you can go through some of these different presets here, and I think you'll find that to be like a valuable source for understanding how things work. Now, there's also a little bit, click on the eye here for information about the plugin itself. If you click on the question mark here, it'll open up bubbles. So if you're curious about what any setting does and you don't want to go digging through the manual, then what you'll do is you'll get a little tip here which will tell you what's going on with all of this. There's one other setting here that I'm not sure I explained exactly well, and that's the relax setting. The relax setting does affect the way that the transients are controlled with the plugin. So as you turn this up higher, there is more consistency, or in other words, you won't get extreme amounts of compression if you put the relax on. So if you have it on linear and you have a transient that goes quite a distance over the threshold, you may get an excessive amount of gain reduction. So this is a way of kind of controlling that and keeping it more consistent throughout a performance, especially if there's more dynamics within the program material that you're trying to master. So this thing is just crazy in terms of its flexibility and control. I just continually get blown away by this more and more. It's really just, I would have to say probably the best thing that I've seen in terms of, by far, hands down, in terms of a digital compressor with all of the controls and everything that you can do with it. And if you're really a person who gets, very into all of those, the minutia of all the settings and all of that control, this is a must-have for you, because this is just an incredibly powerful plugin. Okay, so this concludes the features video for the Unisum plugin, and there's a separate video that has just audio examples on it. If you haven't already watched that, then please take a look for that video as well, and that will give you an insight into just how amazing it sounds. So it's not just a pile of settings, but they actually got to do something that sounds good if you want to buy the plugin. So there you have it, plugin of the week, Tone Project's Unisum.